My sister slept with my boyfriend. I thought she wanted him. I was wrong. Throwaway, obviously, because my real account has half my extended family following it, and I'm not ready for any of them to see this until I've said it the way I actually mean it. This is long. I need it to be long, because the short version is the version that made me hate my own sister for 8 months, and I don't want anyone reading this to make the same mistake I did. I found out my sister had been sleeping with my boyfriend on a Wednesday in October. And the way I found out was almost embarrassingly ordinary for something that ended up detonating my entire family. I'd left my phone charging at his apartment overnight after staying over, which I never did. And when I went back the next afternoon to grab it, a notification had come through from a food delivery app confirming an order placed the previous evening, itemized, time-stamped, and delivered to an address that wasn't his and wasn't mine. It took me embarrassingly little digging, maybe 20 minutes total, sitting on his own couch with his own phone unlocked in my hand because he'd never bothered changing the passcode since I'd first learned it, to find the thread of messages that made the order make sense. My sister's name, saved in his phone under a contact label that made my stomach drop before I'd even opened the conversation. Josie. My name is Della, I'm 28, and Josie is 2 years younger than me. The kind of younger sister most people assume must be a nightmare to grow up with, and who was, in my case, genuinely the opposite, steadier than me in almost every way that mattered. The one who talked me down during my worst breakup in college. The one who drove 4 hours overnight the year our mother had her heart scare without a single second of hesitation. I would have told you, right up until that Wednesday afternoon sitting on my boyfriend's couch, that Josie was the one person in my life I trusted completely. No asterisks, no conditions. The messages I found on Grant's phone didn't just suggest an affair. They documented one, in enough detail that there wasn't a single charitable interpretation left standing by the time I'd scrolled back 4 months, which was as far as the thread went, meaning it had been going on, as far as I could tell, for almost exactly as long as Grant and I had been officially exclusive. I want to describe Grant honestly here, because understanding him matters for everything that comes later, even the parts I got completely wrong at the time. Grant Holloway was 33 when we met, charming in the specific, practiced way that took me embarrassingly long to notice was practiced at all, successful seeming in a vague, hard-to-pin-down way that involved a lot of talk about consulting and portfolio diversification, without ever fully explaining what he actually did for a paycheck day to day. He drove a car nicer than his apparent income should have supported, dressed like money even when he claimed to be between contracts, and had this way of making you feel, in any given conversation, like you were the most interesting, most important person he'd ever had the good fortune to talk to. I fell for him hard and fast, the way you sometimes do with people who seem to have figured out some social frequency the rest of us are only fumbling toward. 6 months into dating, he'd started talking, casually at first and then with increasing specificity, about a joint investment opportunity. He wanted us to build together once things got more serious, something involving a friend of his who ran a private fund with returns that sounded, even to my financially cautious ears, slightly too good to be entirely real. I hadn't committed to anything yet. But I'd started, quietly, looking into whether I could pull equity out of the small condo I owned to have something meaningful to contribute once we got there. The confrontation happened that same evening, because I genuinely could not sit with what I'd found for even a single extra hour. I drove straight to Josie's apartment with Grant's phone still sitting, unreturned, in my bag, some petty, furious part of me wanting the physical evidence in hand when I finally said the words out loud. She opened her door already looking like she knew, which in hindsight should have told me something, because guilt over a straightforward affair doesn't usually look quite like what was on her face. It looked closer to fear. I held up the phone. I didn't even need to say anything specific at first. Her whole body seemed to fold inward the second she saw what I was holding, and she said very quietly, "Della, I can explain, but you have to actually let me explain the whole thing, not just the part that looks bad." I told her, with a coldness I didn't fully recognize in my own voice, that I didn't think there was a version of sleeping with my sister's boyfriend for 4 months that came with an acceptable explanation attached to it. She tried anyway. She kept saying, over and over, some version of "it's not what you think, it was never about him, I need you to trust me," which, given the circumstances, might be the single most useless sentence a person can say to someone they've just betrayed, because trust was exactly the thing that had just been detonated between us. I left without letting her finish whatever she'd been trying to say, and I want to be honest that I've turned that decision over more times than I can count since, wondering whether 4 extra minutes of listening that night would have spared both of us the following 8 months. I blocked her number before I even got back to my car. I confronted Grant the next morning, and true to everything I'd come to understand about him by that point, he barely bothered denying it, admitting the affair with an almost eerie lack of shame, framing it, absurdly, as something that had just happened between two people who were drawn to each other. Language so vague and self-serving, I almost respected the audacity of it even through the fury. I cut him off completely that same day, changed my locks even though he'd never technically had a key, blocked him everywhere I could think to block a person, and told our small shared circle of mutual friends exactly what had happened in language blunt enough that nobody could mistake it for anything gentler than what it actually was. Cutting Josie off proved considerably harder, because unlike Grant, she wasn't a 6-month relationship I could simply excise from my life with a few blocked numbers. She was woven into every family gathering, every group chat, every shared history going back to childhood, and choosing to cut her off meant choosing, functionally, to blow up an enormous portion of my family's normal rhythm along with her. Our mother tried, gently at first and then with increasing frustration, to broker some kind of conversation between us, telling me repeatedly that whatever had happened, family eventually needed to find a way through it, a sentiment that made me want to scream every single time I heard it, because it felt like being asked to simply absorb the betrayal for the sake of everyone else's comfort. I skipped Thanksgiving that year for the first time in my adult life, specifically because Josie would be there. I skipped our father's 60th birthday party 2 months later for the same reason, watching photos of it trickle into the family group chat afterward, and feeling a specific, hollow kind of loneliness I hadn't fully anticipated when I made the decision to stay away. Josie tried reaching out several times over those 8 months, through channels that weren't the blocked number, a card in the mail on my birthday that I threw away unopened, a message sent through our cousin Priya that I told Priya, flatly, I wasn't ready to hear, an email in March that I did open, eventually, months later, out of some combination of curiosity and exhaustion with my own anger, but that I still didn't respond to because the opening line, "I know you think this was about wanting him." And it wasn't, but I can't explain the rest yet, felt at the time like exactly the kind of vague, self-justifying language I'd already decided I didn't have patience for anymore. I want to be honest that some part of me, even then, noticed the specificity of that phrase, "I can't explain the rest yet," and wondered briefly what exactly she meant by "yet." But anger is remarkably good at flattening curiosity into something more manageable, and I let it. The message that finally broke through arrived in June, 8 months after that Wednesday on Grant's couch. A single text from a number I didn't recognize, sent, I later learned, from a burner phone Josie had bought specifically because she assumed, correctly, that I'd blocked every number she actually owned. It said only, "You still don't know why I did it. I have proof now. Please just look at what I'm about to send you before you decide anything else about me." Attached to a follow-up message, a few minutes later was a link to a shared folder, and against every instinct telling me to simply block this number too and move on with my life. Something about the specific phrasing, proof, made my thumb hesitate over the block button long enough for curiosity to win. What I found in that folder took me most of a sleepless night to fully absorb, and by the time I finished going through it, I understood that I had spent 8 months hatting my sister for something that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. The folder contained, among other things, a long, carefully organized document Josie had apparently been building for the better part of a year, screenshots, financial records, and message threads with 3 other women, all documenting a pattern that had nothing to do with romantic betrayal and everything to do with something considerably darker. Grant Holloway, it turned out, was not his actual legal name, or at least not the only one he'd used. Josie had first learned this the previous spring, months before I'd ever even brought him home to meet the family, through a private online forum for people who'd been financially defrauded by romantic partners. A place she'd started frequenting after a coworker mentioned it in passing following her own bad experience with a different man entirely. A post on that forum, written by a woman using the handle Burn Twice, described a man matching Grant's description almost exactly, same physical description, same vague, consulting, cover story, same slow, patient build-up toward a joint investment opportunity that always seemed to surface right around the 6-month mark of a relationship. Timed, it seemed, to land precisely when trust had solidified enough to make large financial requests feel reasonable instead of alarming. Josie had reached out to that woman directly, and what she learned over the following weeks chilled her enough that she started actively investigating on her own, using nothing more sophisticated than careful searching, patience, and the kind of dogged persistence I'd honestly never fully appreciated in her before. She found 2 more women, in 2 different cities, each with startlingly similar stories. A charming, financially vague man who dated them for roughly 6 to 9 months, gradually built toward a joint investment pitch involving a friend's private fund, and then, in each case, either successfully extracted a significant sum of money before quietly vanishing from their lives, or, in one case, extracted the money and remained in the relationship afterward. Using continued emotional investment to delay any serious scrutiny of where the money had actually gone. The photographs each woman eventually shared, comparing notes, made it unmistakable. Same man, different name each time. Here's the part that took me the longest to sit with once I understood it. Josie had recognized him almost immediately the very first time she met him at a family dinner, months before any affair, months before the phone I found on his couch. Not personally. She'd never crossed paths with him before, but from a single blurry photo, one of the other women had posted to that forum months earlier while trying to warn others. She'd sat across from him at our parents' dinner table that first night, making polite small talk about his supposed consulting work, while some cold, careful part of her brain was already cataloging every detail that matched the pattern she'd been researching for weeks. She told me, in a long message that followed the folder a few days later, that her first instinct had simply been to tell me directly, immediately, that night even, except that when she'd gently tried raising a version of it a few weeks afterward, careful and vague, worried about sounding jealous or paranoid, I'd shut the conversation down almost instantly, defensive on Grant's behalf in the specific, absolute way you get when you're a few months into a relationship you badly want to work. She'd tried once more, a little more directly, a month after that, and gotten the same response, sharper that time, enough that she genuinely worried pushing harder without concrete proof would simply cost her the relationship with me entirely while doing nothing to actually protect me from him. So she made a decision I still don't fully know how I feel about, even now, months after understanding all of it. A decision she described in her message with a kind of clinical, careful honesty that made it clear she'd expected me to be angry about the method even after understanding the reason. She decided the only way to get proof solid enough to actually stop him, proof that would survive me being defensive, proof that would hold up regardless of how deep in denial I might be at the time, was to get access to the same financial and communication records the other women had eventually needed months to piece together after the fact, except she wanted it before he could act on whatever he was already building toward with me instead of after. And the only realistic way to get that kind of sustained, unsupervised access to his devices, his financial app logins, the actual paper trail connecting his real identity to the fund he claimed to be building toward with me, was to get genuinely, convincingly close to him herself. I want to be clear that reading this part, even now, doesn't erase the shock of it, or fully resolve the strange, complicated grief sitting underneath everything else. Whatever the reason, my sister spent 4 months in an actual physical relationship with the man I was dating, and no explanation, however well-intentioned, fully undoes the fact that this happened, that there were nights I was somewhere else entirely, trusting completely, while my own sister sat across a table from him building the exact kind of case a prosecutor would eventually need. But the documentation she'd assembled was undeniable once I actually looked at it. Screenshots from his laptop, accessed, she admitted plainly. During nights I assumed she was somewhere else entirely, showing a spreadsheet labeled with initials instead of full names. Tracking, across nearly 6 years, a rotating cast of women and the amounts extracted from each of them, ranging from a low of around $11,000 to a high, for one particularly devastating entry, of just under $90,000. My own initials appeared in that spreadsheet too, in a row still marked, at the time Josie had last accessed it, as pending, with a projected figure beside it that made my hands go cold when I finally understood what it represented. Almost exactly the amount I'd been quietly considering pulling from my condo's equity for that joint investment opportunity Grant had been slowly, patiently building toward with me for months. The final piece, the one that finally, fully answered the question I'd been too angry to ask for 8 months, was a set of messages between Grant and someone Josie had identified, through careful cross-referencing, as the actual operator of the fund he'd been pitching, not a legitimate financial advisor at all, but another man entirely, working some version of the same long con from behind the scenes, coordinating timing across what appeared to be at least 4 active targets simultaneously. Grant being only one of what looked like 2 or 3 men, actually executing the front-facing romantic side of the operation across different cities. The messages showed them discussing timelines, discussing which prospects, their actual word, were closest to being ready for what they called activation. And my own name appeared in that thread too, flagged as ready within the next 6 to 8 weeks, right around the timeline that would have lined up almost exactly with the 1-year anniversary of Grant and me becoming exclusive. Josie had gotten that final set of messages, according to her account, less than a week before I found the food delivery notification on his phone that started everything. She'd been planning, she told me, to come to me directly within days, with everything already assembled, specifically timed, so I'd have hard proof in hand before I could get defensive on his behalf the way I had every previous time she'd tried to warn me more gently. What she hadn't planned for, what none of her careful timing had accounted for, was that I would find the affair itself first, from an entirely unrelated slip involving a food delivery app, days before she was ready to actually explain any of it, leaving her standing in her own doorway that Wednesday night trying to condense 8 months of careful, dangerous investigation into a version of, I can explain, urgent enough to stop me walking away, and failing completely. Because there simply wasn't a version of that sentence short enough to survive the specific, total fury I was standing there with. Before any of that, though, in the days right after reading through that folder for the first time, I did something I'm still not entirely sure I can explain rationally, except that some part of me needed to hear it from someone who wasn't my sister before I'd let myself fully believe it. I reached out to Burn Twice, the woman from that original forum post, using an anonymous account I set up specifically for the purpose, and she agreed, after some understandable hesitation, to meet me in person at a diner 2 towns over from where either of us lived, neutral, anonymous, the kind of place where nobody would recognize either of us. Her real name was Yolanda, and she was maybe 40, with the kind of tired, careful watchfulness in her eyes that I recognized immediately because I suspected it was starting to show up in my own reflection by that point. She told me her version of events almost matter-of-factly, like she'd rehearsed the telling enough times, by then that the sharp edges had been worn down into something closer to procedure than pain. The same slow build-up, the same vague consulting talk, the same 6-month timeline arriving with almost mechanical precision, ending, in her case, with $43,000 gone from a retirement account she was still, 3 years later, working to rebuild. She told me she'd almost not believed Josie either, at first, when my sister had reached out months earlier asking careful, specific questions that made it clear she wasn't just some curious stranger. "Your sister spent longer on this than I expected anyone to," Yolanda said, stirring coffee she never actually drank. "Most people who reach out just want a vent. She wanted proof. She wanted it to actually go somewhere." I asked her, because I needed to ask someone who wasn't emotionally tangled in it the way I was, whether she thought what Josie had done, the specific method, not just the research, was justified. Yolanda was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think," she said finally, "that I would have wanted someone to do exactly that for me 3 years ago, even if I'd have been furious about the method too at first. Sometimes the only proof that actually works is the kind nobody wants to have to go get." Our parents found out roughly a week after Yolanda and I met, not because I told them directly, but because Josie, in a moment of what she later described as simply running out of the emotional energy to keep managing two separate versions of the truth, told our mother everything in a single long phone call one night, expecting, I think, to be met with the same fury I'd initially thrown at her. Instead, our mother called me within the hour, her voice tight with a mixture of shock and something that took me a moment to recognize as pride, and said, almost disbelieving, "Did you know your sister basically ran her own investigation for a year?" I told her I was still working through exactly how I felt about the how of it, even while understanding the why, and she said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward, gentler than I expected given how hard she'd pushed the two of us toward reconciliation all those months, without knowing the actual stakes involved. "I pushed you to forgive her without knowing what there even was to forgive," she said. "I think I owe you both an apology for that." Our father took it harder in a different direction entirely, quiet for days after learning the details, and when he finally called me, his first question wasn't about the affair at all. It was whether I was safe now, whether there was anything else Grant's operation might still be able to reach, a question that made me realize, for the first time, how frightened he'd actually been underneath his usual composure once he understood what had really been circling our family for the better part of a year. I confronted Grant again after understanding all of this, though confronted undersells what actually happened, because by that point, I'd also gone to the police with everything Josie had assembled, along with, eventually, the 3 other women she'd been in contact with throughout her investigation, each of them willing, once they understood a formal case was finally being built, to come forward with their own records. I won't pretend the legal process that followed was fast or fully satisfying. Financial fraud cases involving cross-jurisdictional deception rarely are, according to the detective who eventually caught the case, a patient, thorough woman named Odalise Ferreira who told me plainly, early on, not to expect quick resolution even with strong evidence. But it was, eventually, enough. Grant, whose actual legal name turned out to be something else entirely, was arrested 4 months later on charges spanning 3 separate jurisdictions, along with the man behind the coordinating operation Josie had uncovered in those final messages. I never did get to hear, in a courtroom or anywhere else, the version of an apology that would have made any of it feel resolved, and I've mostly made my peace with the fact that I probably never will. Josie and I didn't speak again in person until almost 2 months after that first message with the folder attached, mostly because understanding the reason behind what she'd done didn't instantly repair 8 months of genuine, deeply felt betrayal, even once the betrayal itself turned out to mean something entirely different than I'd assumed. We met, eventually, at a coffee shop neither of us had ever been to before, neutral ground, both of us too nervous to suggest anywhere with any shared history attached to it. I asked her, once we'd gotten through the initial, awkward silence, the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since that night in June. Why hadn't she found some other way, any other way, to get what she needed, instead of the one method guaranteed to look, from the outside, exactly like the worst possible kind of betrayal? She told me, quietly, that she'd asked herself the same question more times than she could count, especially during the months I wasn't speaking to her, and that the honest answer was that she genuinely hadn't been able to find one. Every other approach she'd tried, or seriously considered, either moved too slowly to beat his own timeline with me, or risked tipping him off long before there was enough evidence to actually stop him. And somewhere in the middle of that impossible calculation, she'd made a choice she still wasn't entirely sure had been the right one, except for the fact that it had worked, that it had actually stopped him before he'd managed to take anything from me at all. Which was more than any of his 3 previous documented targets could say. That first coffee shop meeting wasn't the only difficult conversation we had over the following months, just the first one. And I think it's worth being honest that the ones that came after weren't easier simply because the initial shock had worn off. There was a night in August, almost 3 months after the folder, when I called her at nearly midnight after waking from a dream I still don't fully remember the specifics of, except that it left me shaking and needing to hear her voice, and she picked up on the first ring, like some part of her had been braced for that call for months without either of us saying so out loud. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, not really about Grant at all by the end of it, just about us, about the version of our relationship that had existed before any of this, and whether it was something we could actually rebuild or whether we'd simply be constructing something new out of the wreckage and calling it the same thing out of habit. She told me at one point that the hardest part for her, throughout the entire 8 months I wasn't speaking to her, hadn't been the investigation itself, or even the danger of staying close enough to Grant to keep gathering what she needed. It had been sitting through family dinners she could no longer attend, watching photos from Thanksgiving and our father's birthday scroll past in the group chat, knowing exactly why she wasn't in any of them, and not being able to explain it to a single person who asked. "I chose it," she said. "I want to be clear, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me over a choice I made on purpose. I just think you should know it cost me too, even though I understood exactly why it had to." There was also, I'll admit, a harder conversation buried somewhere in the middle of all that reconciliation, one I put off for weeks because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I asked her, eventually, whether any part of what happened with Grant, physically, had felt like anything real to her. Whether I needed to worry about that on top of everything else sitting between us. She didn't flinch from the question, which I've come to appreciate more the further we get from that period, and told me, plainly, that it had been the single hardest part of the entire year for her precisely because none of it had ever been real in the way it needed to look from the outside, and that maintaining that performance, night after night, for months, while genuinely liking almost nothing about the man across from her, had cost her more than she'd expected going in. I believed her. I still believe her. It doesn't make the specific fact of it easier to sit with completely, even now, but it does mean I no longer spend nights wondering whether there was some real, competing feeling underneath everything else that I'd simply lost her to. There wasn't. There was only ever the investigation, and me, in that order, the entire time. I won't pretend our relationship is fully back to what it was before that Wednesday in October. There's a specific kind of strangeness that sits between us now, even on good days, a knowledge, on both sides, of exactly how far she was willing to go, and how long she was willing to let me hate her for it, in service of protecting me from something I couldn't see coming on my own. Some days that strangeness feels like a wound still healing. Other days, more often now than it used to, it feels like something closer to the deepest possible proof of how much she actually loves me, delivered in a form so unrecognizable at first that it took me 8 furious months and a folder full of evidence to see it for what it actually was. Our mother knows most of the story now, though I've kept some of the harder financial specifics from her, mostly to spare her the full weight of exactly how close I came to losing my condo's equity to a stranger wearing a familiar, charming face. She still doesn't fully understand why it had to unfold the way it did. And honestly, some days, neither do I, but I know this much clearly now, in a way I didn't at all 8 months ago, sitting on Grant's couch with his unlocked phone in my shaking hands. Sometimes the person who looks, from the outside, like the one doing the betraying, is actually the only person standing between you and something considerably worse, and you don't always get the luxury of understanding which version of the story you're actually living inside of until long after the worst of it is already over. So here's the question I still don't have a fully settled answer to, even now, and maybe that's why I finally sat down and wrote all of this out in full instead of just carrying it around privately the way I have for months. If someone you loved lied to you in the most painful, specific way imaginable, for months, in order to protect you from something you couldn't see coming, and it actually worked, does the method still count as the same kind of betrayal it would have been without the reason behind it? I've turned that question over more times than I can count since that afternoon in the coffee shop, and the honest truth is I still land somewhere different depending on the day. Most days, I land on forgiveness. Some days, I don't fully manage it yet. I'm not sure that uncertainty ever fully resolves itself for either of us, and I've mostly stopped expecting it to. Edit, for everyone asking in the comments, yes, The case against Grant and the other man involved is still moving through the court system. And no, I'm not going to share details that could compromise it. To the people asking whether I've forgiven my sister, I think forgiveness turned out to be a much longer, much less linear process than I expected it to be. And I'm still somewhere in the middle of it, most days closer to the end than I was a month ago. Second edit. Josie read an earlier draft of this before I posted it and asked me to add one thing, so I will. She wants anyone reading this who thinks they might be seeing a similar pattern in their own relationship. The vague income, the slow buildup toward a joint investment, the 6-month timeline, to trust that instinct enough to actually look closer, carefully, before it costs you what it almost cost me.